In this video I'm going to demonstrate how to set up a dripping roofline using wet stuff to create tiny wet splashes and a weather integration such as Enviro. So you can see here we've got this roofline along the edge of this roof, and if I drag this slider which removes the wetness effect, you can see it's been creating splashes down on the floor below the roofline where it's dripping. Now this is driven entirely by the weather. In this case I'm using Enviro. As the rain intensity increases, the amount of drips increases, and as the rain intensity decreases, the amount of drips decreases until eventually it stops and all of the little splashes fade away. So let's have a look how to set this up. I have a copy of the scene that I was just demoing to you. Now you can see we've got this roof here, that's taken from the Unity Viking Village pack. And we've got these nice barrels as well, they were also taken from that same pack. So what we want to do is make the front edge of this roof line drip as it's raining. So we've already set up Enviro in this scene, but this same thing applies for any weather system, not just Enviro. So the first thing we need to do is create a wetness source. Now this is how wet stuff actually gets the information from the weather system about how wet the environment is. So I'm going to add an Enviro wetness source. So this is querying Enviro. This can go anywhere in the scene. I like to place it next to the Enviro setup just for consistency. Now I'm going to create another game object. This one will contain the drip lines. So the first thing to do is create another child game object under that. So we'll call this drip line 1 and add a drip line component. Now you can see this is already set up several other components for me. I've got particle system, which is currently making a mess of the scene, a particle wet splatter, which is a standard part of wet stuff. This takes collisions from a particle system and automatically creates a tiny little wet splatter where every single particle hits. And then we've got this drip line component with a few warnings in the inspector, so let's have a look at those. The first warning is choose an environmental wetness provider component. So this is what we dropped onto the Enviro setup just a second ago. Again, this applies to any weather system. They're all going to have one of these wetness sources. You just need to drop that in there. So there we go, that warning's gone away. Now the next one is choose a start and end point for the line from which the particles will spawn. So this is pretty simple. What this does is create drips from a line. So of course we need the start and end positions of that line. So I'm going to create 2 more game objects, and then I'm going to put that at the start of my line. So I'm just embedding this a tiny little bit into the actual object, not too much. We obviously don't want the particles to appear from deep inside the wood. We also don't want the particles to appear from way out in front of the wood in mid-air. One thing you should consider is if this wood has collision geometry, then the particles will place a splatter wherever they collide. So you want to make sure that your line doesn't intersect the collision geometry of your roof, otherwise the splatters will not go anywhere, they'll just end up on the roof and that won't look very good. Now we go back here and we put start and end into those 2 points. All the warnings have gone away, so I can close that and open up the next one. The first thing to do is simply to click Auto Configure Particle System, and they've all stopped, and now you will see they're dripping from this line just occasionally. So we've auto configured the particle system. Now we've also got this particle wet splatter, which is what actually creates the splashes when particles hit something. So again, auto configure that. Now finally we have these other settings. These are not critical, but you may want to consider them for certain scenarios. So live update transform means that every frame the emission point is updated to always connect these two balls. So if you don't expect the balls to be moving, don't turn this on. And then the emission rate multiplier, this changes how many particles are emitted for a given value. Say you have a roof which has a gutter leading down to it, so there's a very large amount of water dropping off that roof, you might turn the emission rate up a lot. On the other hand, say you have a very small roof, maybe it's slightly sheltered by another roof, so it really doesn't collect very many raindrops, you might want to turn the emission rate multiplier down to some very low value, so you just get a very occasional raindrop. Now we have this final warning here: add one or more particle wet splatter template components to define the decals placed by this splatter component. So what that means is the particle wet splatter, when a particle hits the ground, it creates a decal. But what decal does it create? Well, that is controlled by a template. So we can add multiple templates if we want, and you can set the probability of each template. So I'm going to create two, and I'm going to set them both to probability 1, which means there's a 50-50 chance of each one being selected. We want the mode to be wet, that means it places splashes on the floor. Saturation, these are tiny drops from rain, so you don't want saturation to be particularly high. I'm going to set them around 0.7, 0.8, something like that. So now if we turn on these detail layers, we need a detail mask. So I'm going to use the default particle for 1, and you can see here this is the wetness curve of it. So this is the input, this is what's actually in the texture. You can see it goes from 0, that's completely dry, and it doesn't quite hit 1 in the middle, which is completely wet. So if I change the threshold a little bit, so we get a very wet point in the centre with a nice soft fade off, and then I can change the softness to change the angle of that fade off. Since this is a splatter, I'm going to give it a fairly sharp edge, I think. Now the other one, I'm going to do a similar thing, but I'm going to use this particle splash texture, which has lots of little splatters. And again, I'm going to open up this levels visualizer. So you can see this has lots of tiny little splatters, and they go again from 0, which is completely dry, almost but not quite up to 1, which is completely wet. So I'm just going to bump that up a tiny bit so we do actually get some completely wet spots. And I'm going to lower the softness a little. That just makes these edges a little sharper. Maybe something like that. So now we have two templates. So every time one of these particles hits the floor, it's going to choose one of these two templates randomly and create it. It started to rain. This is controlled by the weather integration. Again, in this case that's Enviro. And you can see that it's very slowly starting to drip. And as the rain continues to get heavier, that's going to get faster and faster. You can see tiny little splatters here. There's one of the plain old circular ones. Here's some of the ones using the multiple splashes. And that's it. That's how you set up drip lines using wet stuff and a weather integration.